Hi. Um, Many African countries, following the attainment of independence and appreciating or realizing that their economies were severely underdeveloped, decided to implement several strategies to develop their economies. And so we want to today talk about the first strategy for African development that was implemented by many developing countries following the attainment of independence. The first one we want to talk about is called import substitution industrialization. Import substitution industrialization. Now, this strategy became the cornerstone of many African countries throughout the period of the 1960s and 1970s. Around that time, it had been realized that the international trade had accounted tremendously for the deterioration of the terms of trade of many African countries, to the disadvantage of countries of African descent and countries of African origin who relied more on imports and exported little. So it had been discovered that African countries were importing more than they were exporting. And you know, as you may be aware, that if a country does more imports than exporting, and also if a country is only exporting raw materials without finishing or sort of refining or adding value to those raw materials, and you merely export them, then it means you're going to have severe balance of payment challenges, you're going to have balance of payment deficits. And so at the time of independence, many African countries were into international trade, but it was in a manner such that they were importing more than exporting. And so the idea was to introduce import substitution industrialization so that they will be manufacturing products that were being imported locally. So import substitution industrialization essentially entail the following: that one, goods that were hitherto imported were to be manufactured locally. So state-owned enterprises and state-owned corporations and public corporations were set up by these by many of these newly independent African states, so that these public corporations, state-owned enterprises and companies run by the state would attempt to manufacture goods that were previously being imported locally. It also entailed the imposition of quota system on the importation of specific goods, so that we do not encourage people to be overly importing those products. So if you want to import certain specific products, you place quotas on them. You don't want excessive import that had already plagued the country with balance of payment challenges. Import substitution industrialization also meant that sometimes the regimes that were implementing them as a strategy for African development had to invite other foreign firms into their country to manufacture products that these regimes or the countries in which these regimes were operating could not manufacture. So that's how come in Ghana and in many developing countries we had foreign companies like Sanyo, like Phyllis coming in, being invited in here in our country to be producing TVs, fridges, radios, etc., etc. So that's about import substitution. So three things: setting up state-owned industries to manufacture goods that were previously being imported here. Number two, imposition of quotas or quota system on the importation of certain specific products so that people do not overly import them. And three, inviting foreign firms here to manufacture products that we ourselves cannot manufacture locally. That's what import substitution industrialization entails. Now, many of these state-owned industries and many of these corporations and companies that were set up by the state to manufacture products that were previously being imported ran at a loss, but their existence were supported. The existence they were supported to keep running. Governments at the time pumped monies into them to sustain them, even though they were running at a loss. And this intervention was justified by the infant industry argument. The idea is that if you set up a new company to manufacture product that is new, oftentimes when the product is on the market, you may not even break even, you may run at a loss. But if you give yourself, you may run at a loss because of teething challenges and the fact that people may not be familiar with the products. But if you give yourselves about 5 years for the company to run and for the products to be known to the market, people who get to know the product would eventually be buying the products, and so you move from running at a loss to breaking even and then to be making some profit. Now, import substitution industrialization again was an anti-imperialist policy, and hence it was very attractive to most independent African countries. They felt that, well, we have broken the yoke of colonialism, and so we are independent we are independent states, we are sovereign states, and so we would have the capacity to manufacture products here without necessarily going abroad to import them. So it was seen as an anti-imperialist policy, but at the same time, it was also a pro-imperialist policy, since it also meant that foreign investors and foreign companies like Valco, like Sanyo, etc., had to be invited in to Ghana for them to manufacture products here. And sometimes these foreign firms that were brought in were actually protected from competition. And so even though it was an anti-imperialist strategy, it was at the same time a pro-imperialist, strategy. In terms of the benefits of the import substitution industrialization, one can say that the local economies of many African states became industrialized, with several industries being set up to produce goods that were hitherto imported. Now, this created a sense of self-reliance and a sense of independence among many of these African states. Again, these industries that were set up, whether we like it or not, they created some employment for people who were jobless at the time of independence. So at the time of independence, so many people who have supported these independent fighters realized that, well, we are gaining independence, but we have no work to do. And so the idea of setting up industries locally to manufacture products that were previously imported created some jobs for them. Now, also, the import substitution industrialization as a strategy generated some linkages in the economy, since local mechanics, local repairers, local electronic manufacturers, local repairers, local people sprang up to repair some of the goods that, especially electronic gadgets, that were manufactured, here in our part of the world. So Sanyo comes to set up its industry company here. They manufacture TVs and fridges. Then local people also spring up to know how to repair these fridges and TVs and radios. So they also offer apprenticeship training to others who want to learn, and then that kind of relationship goes on, and people also find job to do. But in terms of criticism, the strategy was criticized because most of the profits that were made from industries that had been set up in the developing countries, like Ghana, for instance, were repatriated abroad, since most of the industries established relied on foreign exports. Again, the economy of these countries that were practicing the ISI, import substitution industrialization, heavily still depended on the importation of high capital goods, and this meant that we needed enough resources to still be important, and it also meant that because they relied on capital goods, even though the strategy had generated more employment, it still did not. The employment did not benefit a lot of people, because jobs that were supposed to be manually done by human beings were done by machines. Again, import substitution industrialization as a strategy brought up a certain bureaucratic requirement in determining which of the companies abroad would have to be brought in to set up here to manufacture products here. And this bureaucratic requirement oftentimes created an opportunity for rent-seeking and corruption. Now, so what is the basis for selecting Sanyo, for instance, to come and manufacture here and not LG? Okay, so many competition as to who must be brought in here, brought about certain bureaucratic requirements, and then also some corrupting relations that got developed between those who were inviting these industries, foreign industries, and these foreign industries coming. And so bribes had to be paid here and there, so that we would decide on which particular people will be able to decide on which particular brand or company would have to be invited from abroad to come in to manufacture here. Now, ISI, because it was also talking about industry, led to a somewhat neglect of agriculture and the emergence of a large state sector with its attendant politicization, overstaffing, and inefficiencies. So, number one, a neglect of agriculture, because we're talking about industrialization, and then also it blossomed. It expanded the frontiers of the state, because state-owned industries and companies were established, and it means you recruited also so many people into these state-owned industries, and recruitment into it got politicized. Because of excessive recruitment, you have problems of overstaffing and inefficiencies. So, and then I may also want to say that because many of the goods were manufactured for local consumption, it led to the manufacture of quite shoddy products that were not that never suffered or experienced any competition with the foreign market. And because there wasn't that much competition, the products were shoddy, and because they were shoddy, they still brought about, they created the crave among many people for still foreign products. Now, in terms of the future, or how the import substitution industrialization fared, around 1973, there was a conflict between Israel and Arabian countries. And so the Israeli-Arab conflict led to an increment in world oil prices from $3 per barrel to $15 per barrel. Now, given the role of oil in industrialization, the cost of energy rose, which immediately widened the balance of payment deficit for many African countries that were implementing the import substitution industrialization. Now, in 1978, the oil prices worsened because of still the crisis, Israeli-Arab war. And so a price of oil per barrel moved from $15 per barrel to $40 per barrel, placing additional burden on African leaders pursuing import substitution industrialization. So the cost of products in other advanced production, the cost of the products in other advanced countries went astronomically high, and these were the same products or the same goods that were needed to keep local industries running. So as the developed market increased their prices of goods and services they sent to Africa, they at the same time reduced their demand of goods and services exported from Africa to their shores. Okay, and so that meant oil pricing, when they go up, affects everything. And so times became hard for people in advanced countries. And so, well, if they were importing things from Africa, they reduced. And they reduced it. But at the same time, the kinds of things that Africans imported from them, their pricing went high because of the increase in the world oil prices. Now, everything had gone up, and Africans themselves needed more resources to be able to buy capital goods whose pricing had gone up to be able to power their industries, to continue to keep the state-owned enterprise and public corporations that had been set up, to keep them running afloat, to keep them running, to break even. Now, in the process of looking for more resources to be able to keep their industries running, they had to go to other countries. By 1980s, for instance, European countries themselves had decided to impose some conservative economic measures by cutting costs and then on themselves, and cutting costs, and then also making the cost of borrowing quite high. Now, African leaders themselves had to borrow more money to be able to, like I said, procure capital goods whose pricing had gone up because of increase in world oil prices, so that they will be able to keep their industries afloat. But the Europeans themselves were cutting costs, and they themselves were implementing austerity measures on themselves. Now, if you're going to borrow money from somebody and the person is implementing austerity measures on himself, if the person where you are going to borrow money, the people there are tightening their belt, then you cannot go and borrow the money without you also being asked to tighten your belt. And so this necessitated the imposition of austerity measures on African countries, and African countries and their leaders were asked to also tighten their belts. And this led to the beginning of the structural adjustment program, or the introduction of the structural adjustment program to Africa as a conditionality for the acquisition or for securing more external assistance and aid from Europeans and from the Bretton Woods institution. We'll talk about the structural adjustment program as another strategy for African development in the next lecture.